22:15. But Jeremiah, Yahweh is talking to Jeremiah. He says, "They are all grievous revolters, walking with slanders. They are brass and iron. They are all corrupters. The bellows are burned. The lead is consumed of the fire. The founder melts in vain." The guy that's sitting here trying to smelt this stuff is having a hard time getting this dross out. It just won't come out. For the wicked are not plucked away. Reprobate silver shall men call them, because Yahweh has rejected them. Yahweh has rejected them. So it's something to keep in mind as far as our concerns are with the dross that comes out of the silver. We've talked about silver represents redemption, but now we're seeing that brass, lead, iron, we'll talk about tin in a minute, all represent corruption. That if it lingers in that silver's not pure, that silver's no good. And sometimes you just can't get it out. So the redemption is a false redemption as well. Everybody with me? Okay. Brass, copper, and bronze in the scriptures have a strong correlation between the subjects of judgment or justification. And this correlation is found in many places. And we see this correlation within these next scriptures. The word for brass, copper, and bronze in Torah is the same. It's nechoshet. Nechoshet also means filthiness, harlotry, lust, and doubt. And the root of nechoshet is nachash, which means a serpent, and as such is a representation of tet, our option of choice between the sin of disobedience and judgment, as well as our choice to be cleansed from sin and delivered from death. It's all up to us. We choose. We see the polished brass serpent that was raised up on the pole, and I'm probably jumping ahead of myself, that when the people were bit by the vipers, that if they didn't want to die, they looked up to the serpent of brass on the pole, and they were healed. But if you didn't, you died from the bite of the viper. So there's quite a few scriptures, so I'm going to list a few of them for us to discuss. And I didn't really go into a whole lot of detail. The scriptures are there for y'all to open up the Torah and go to them. But we have the brazen laver at Shemot 29, 1 and 30:17 through 21. The brazen laver was basically a polished brass bowl. And it was there that the priest would come and wash themselves to be cleaned before going into the service of Elohim. So this polished brass is a representation of forgiveness of sin, in a sense that it makes us clean. It takes our sin and it holds it in the water, and we are able to go on to our service. So we see in here polished brass as a representation of something that cleans us from our iniquity. Talks about the vessels to hold the flesh of the sacrificial animals and to collect the ashes, which is a symbol of death. And we find this in Shemot 27:3 and 38:3, which we had different items made out of brass. Again, clean brass that would take the sacrifice and put it on top of what would be unpolished, dirty brass, where the fire and the coals would be, in order to burn the sacrifice. So we see that something clean lifts us up, but we see that the fire is where the sin goes, and we see that it is there that we get an idea that unpolished brass is something that holds sin. Okay? Now, they say that the brazen altar, when we get to that, is a representation of Yahshua, that the sacrifice goes into it and it is burned away, it's done away with. So there's something to think about, I guess, when you go back over these. But the thing is that within brass we have clean brass that represents being cleaned of iniquity. And we have dirty brass, which represents sin. We also have the pegs of the temple, the stakes that held the curtains down, which were made out of unpolished brass, which is a representation, again, of being unclean. But we also, we're jumping ahead, that Yahshua, the feet of Yahshua, when we get to Revelation, were like fine brass. So when he walked the earth, he walked like us. But when he fulfilled the mission of the Father, his feet were like polished brass. So we'll talk about that some other time. Anyway, we have the fetters of brass. I guess these are kind of like brass handcuffs that represent bondage for disobedience. And in Judges 16:21, in Judges 16, it talks about Samson. And it talks about his eyes being put out and that he was placed in fetters of brass and put in prison. Okay? That when you lose perception and you are disobedient because of your loss of perception, that you come into bondage. So in this case, brass represents the bondage that comes from disobedience and the judgment that is rendered in that case. In 2 Kings 25:7 is another type of disobedience, that it is King Zedekiah that sins against Nebuchadnezzar, and that his eyes are put out because he loses perception of Elohim in his situation. And he's also put in fetters of brass and placed in bondage. So it's another idea of falling into bondage because of our lack of perception and being disobedient because of our lack of perception. Now, the brazen altar is a forgiveness of sin and deliverance from death. So the brazen altar is where these sacrifices are placed in order to be consumed. And we find that in Shemot 27:1 to 29 and verses 18. And also in Vayikra 6:12. Life in forgiveness and justification, the brass couplings. In Shemot 26:11, we also find that there are couplings of brass that also hold the temple together. So it's not just our Elohim that holds us together, the spirit of our Elohim, the Ruach that he breathed into us, but ultimately it is redemption that will keep us together. Because if we lose redemption, then we will no longer, we'll no longer be in existence in a sense, because you can't put a tabernacle together without these rings of brass. Okay? But again, the brass couplings talked about in Shemot 26:11. The brazen censers making teshuvah. Now, the brazen censers are an interesting object. They were used to hold incense to be offered before Elohim. And we find that if we make the wrong offerings in these brazen censers, that if we offer the wrong kind of prayer, the wrong kind of service, the wrong kind of sacrifice, the wrong kind of anything to Elohim, that it leads to death. What did the sons of Aaron do? They loaded up some funky incense on the censers and they offered it to Elohim, and they were consumed by fire. They were destroyed. On the other hand, the rebellion of Korach where Korach and 250 of his friends got together and said, we all want to be Levites, we all want to serve in the temple, and they all brought brazen censers. We found that that didn't go over very well either. Without teshuvah and the incense being lifted up in the right censer, that it almost annihilated the congregation in and of itself. Had Aaron not ran with the incense in the censer the way it was supposed to be and offered it up. And as a result, Korach and his friends were swallowed up by the ground, and there was still a great loss amongst the children of Israel until it was straightened out by Aaron, offering the right kind of incense in the censer the way it was supposed to have been done. So we see a representation of teshuvah over rebellion, turning away from falsehood and moving in the right direction into the word of Elohim, according to the word of Elohim. The brazen serpent, the choice in teshuvah and life, or rebellion and death. And again, we have a choice, or they had a choice. They were bitten by the viper, they could die, or they could look at the serpent made out of polished brass and live. It's our choice in text that we can crawl on our bellies like the serpent and end up like the dust, or we can bow before Elohim through his word and find our way through that narrow door into the garden to be able to partake from the tree of life in the world to come. Revelation 2:18 says this, and unto the angel of the assembly of Thyatira write, these things says the Son of Yahuwah, who has his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass, like fine brass. Polished brass, unlike unpolished brass, represents redemption from sin and forgiveness. The feet of polished brass of Yahshua take us back to the covenant where a kinsman could redeem another by removing a sandal. He would hand the sandal to the person who he was redeeming, the person that needed to be redeemed from. And then the person would let him go. We remember that Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist in our best Greek, who said that one greater than he is coming, whose sandal he was not worthy to remove. Only through Yahshua and these polished feet of brass can redemption and forgiveness come. Everybody with me? All right. Yes. Iron. Iron is a representation of bondage and judgment. In the scriptures, there's a strong correlation between the use of iron and the subject of bondage. Egypt is referred to as the iron furnace in 3 verses of scripture. The first time we see it is at Devarim 4:20. We see it again in Jeremiah 11:4, and then 1 Kings 8. We also read, and I think that's supposed to be 1 Kings 8:3, but it talks about Egypt as being the iron furnace. We also read about Egypt being the house of bondage out of the words of Yahuwah. When he said, I am Yahuwah Elohim, I am the one who took you out of the house of bondage in Egypt. Okay? I am the one who has set you free. So again, Elohim himself makes this correlation between Egypt and bondage. So when we see iron, it's always going to talk about bondage or judgment. While the metal iron speaks to bondage, the word for furnace that's used in scriptures represents judgment. Thus, Egypt, as the iron furnace, connects both the bondage of the children of Israel and the judgment of Elohim together. Why did they go into bondage? We say, well, it's because there was another Pharaoh, and this Pharaoh changed his mind, and he saw that the children of Israel were becoming great, and he was all wigged out about it. The fact is that Elohim told Jacob not to leave Canaan, and Jacob was disobedient, and he brought his family of 70 into Egypt because there was a famine. And Pharaoh would take care of them, and all this stuff would be great. He depended on something other than Elohim to provide for his needs. And he went against the commandment of Yahweh Elohim. Now, we move a few years into the future. We have the story of Goliath of Gath. We can consider that his armor is a type of bondage and judgment. And it talks throughout it talks throughout Samuel about his armor, that it was iron, and the big old spear that he carried, and the big old sword that he carried. But it talks about his armor being made of iron. Goliath was a champion of the Philistines. He was an enemy of Israel. Goliath defied the armies of Israel. When Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. When we read 1 Samuel 17, 8-11. Now, Goliath wanted to enslave the people of Israel. If we consider that, he was a giant and thought that no one could take him in battle. We said the people of Israel were greatly afraid of Goliath. They did not think anyone could stand up to this giant. So while Goliath was a real man who defied the armies of Israel, he was also a type of Satan. Now, we really need to consider these next couple of sentences and really reflect on those and think about these. Satan is a giant in the eyes of the children of Elohim. Okay? People, whether they want to admit it or not, are afraid of Satan. And we find people pleading, oh, please don't let Satan do this. Satan doesn't come after you, and Satan doesn't attack you, and Satan doesn't knock you down. All he does is picks up a really nice piece of fruit and says, isn't this pretty? And you say, yeah, that's really nice, I want that. We're the one that does the damage. Okay? In the flesh, they cannot defeat him in battle. In the flesh, we say we cannot defeat Satan in battle. And when we seek to fight by our own strength, we certainly cannot defeat Satan in battle. We have two different stories, the one of Ish and Satan using his ventriloquist act through the serpent, where she was totally all turned around and wigged out in Scripture. And we also have the story of Yahshua, who was able to respond back according to the Word, using Scripture to overcome or to correct improperly used Scripture that was thrown at him. So when we try to fight things on our own strength, we can't. We try to twist Scripture to work for our benefit, we can't. It's only when we use Scripture according to the way it's supposed to be used that we can overcome. Our problems and issues are also types for Goliath. David said that he wasn't coming to fight depending on his own strength, but that it was by the word of Yahweh that he would overcome Goliath. We can't fight by our own strength. It's only by the word of Yahweh that we can overcome Satan, the devil, the adversary, and the deceiver. So we also consider from iron that it's a form of judgment that will break us, but that we can be restored by the master potter. If we consider Psalms 2:9, it says, you shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And then we read Yahshua's words at Revelation 2:27, where he talks about